You loved her, not halfway, not in pieces. You gave everything, your time, your patience, your soul, and somehow you were still the one who walked away, not because you wanted to, but because staying meant slowly dying in silence. You stopped talking not because you had nothing to say, but because every word turned into a misunderstanding. You stopped reaching not because you didn't care, but because you got tired of being met with cold distance. You stopped fighting not because you didn't want to fix it, but because you were the only one holding the pieces together. She didn't see it. How you were slowly fading. How you would lie awake next to her and still feel like you were sleeping alone. You hoped it would change. You waited longer than you should have. You gave more than you had. But at some point you realized, if you didn't leave now, there'd be nothing left of you to save. That's the kind of pain people don't talk about. The heartbreak that doesn't come from being left, but from loving so much you had to leave. If you've ever looked at the woman you love and knew deep in your chest that staying would cost you everything, this is your story. And no, you're not weak. You're not heartless. You're not a coward. You're the man who left while he was still in love. And you're not the only one. In the next few minutes, we'll talk about why men like you, mature, loyal, emotionally present, walk away, not because the love is gone, but because they are. So stay with me. This is the conversation no one ever gave you, and it starts now. Who are they? The men who choose silence over chaos, disappearance over destruction, goodbye over losing themselves completely. He's not the man chasing thrills anymore. At 45, 50, 60, his heart no longer beats for chaos. The late nights, the drama, the constant proving of worth, he's outgrown all of it. He's not looking for fireworks. He's looking for calm. Not the kind of calm that comes from silence, but the kind that comes from finally being understood without explanation. This is a man who has built, lost, rebuilt. He's loved with his whole heart, failed more than once, and carried regrets like old photographs, faded but never forgotten. He's not jaded, he's just tired of running in circles. Tired of relationships that feel more like survival than peace. He's the man who listens more than he speaks. Not because he's unsure of what to say, but because he's learned the weight of words. He's not looking for someone to complete him. He's looking for someone who doesn't make him feel like he's not enough. He wants softness, not weakness, but warmth. He wants space, not distance, but breathing room. He wants presence, not attention, but connection. He is the kind of man who has fought many battles internally and out loud. And now he's not searching for another war to win. He's searching for a place to rest, a place to just be, without fear, without performance. Like a soldier who's laid down his weapons, he no longer needs to conquer, he just wants to come home. To peace, to quiet love, to something steady. But here's the question no one dares to ask. If all he wants is peace, why is he still the one who ends up walking away? Let's find out. They don't leave suddenly. For men like him, walking away is never impulsive. It's a quiet process, slow, silent, invisible from the outside. But on the inside, something's been unraveling for a long time. It often starts with the smallest cracks, moments where he bites his tongue instead of speaking his truth, where he agrees just to keep the peace, where he stops showing pieces of himself because he's learned they won't be accepted. And anyway, over time he starts to vanish bit by bit. He becomes someone who says, "I'm fine," when he's not. Someone who smiles at dinner but feels completely alone across the table. Someone who forgets what it's like to be seen, really seen for who he is, not just for what he provides. He's not leaving because he wants to. He's leaving because he no longer recognizes the man he's become while trying to keep the relationship alive. It's not just about emotional disconnection. It's about emotional starvation. He's gone too long without being asked how he feels, without being heard when he answers. He longs for connection that goes deeper than surface-level talk. He wants someone who meets him in the silence, someone who sees past the routine, someone who notices when his smile doesn't reach his eyes. But instead, the space between them keeps growing. The conversations turn shallow. The intimacy feels mechanical. And the only place he feels truly alone is right next to the person he loves. And then there's the exhaustion. He's tired of explaining himself. Tired of defending his tone, his needs, his choices. Tired of the constant tension that turns every small disagreement into a battlefield. He no longer wants to argue about who's right. He just wants peace. So he stops talking. Not because he doesn't care, but because every time he tries, he feels like he's only making things worse. Eventually, silence becomes his way of surviving, and that silence becomes distance, and that distance becomes a decision. He once believed that love could fix anything, That love was enough. But now he knows love without respect doesn't last. Love without understanding breaks him. Love without space to breathe becomes suffocating. He's learned the hard way that loving someone doesn't always mean staying. Sometimes it means letting go before resentment replaces affection. And then there's the weight. No one sees the years of effort, the emotional labor, the countless sacrifices. He showed up. He stayed loyal. He compromised. But the truth is, he never felt fully valued for what he gave. His effort became expected, his presence taken for granted, his pain overlooked. And when a man feels invisible in the very place he's trying hardest to belong, he starts to ask himself, what's the point of staying where I'm not truly seen? So he begins to detach, not out of coldness, but because he's exhausted every way to make it work. He folds the last of his shirts into a suitcase with hands that still shake. Behind him, the woman he loves stands silent, facing the wall. He still loves her. That's the part no one understands. But love, as he's learned, isn't always a reason to stay. And so, he leaves. Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with a kind of grief only men like him carry. They still care, but they walk away. Because sometimes the cost of holding on is losing themselves completely. Love doesn't always end in anger. Sometimes it lingers quiet, present, but no longer able to hold two people together. It stays in the room like the scent of a memory, like a photograph you never had the heart to throw away. He didn't stop loving her. That's not why he left. The love was still there. But over time it began to feel like a beautiful shirt, 2 sizes too small, something that once fit perfectly but now clings too tightly, makes it hard to breathe. He kept wearing it, hoping it would stretch, hoping it would soften with time. But it didn't. It began to suffocate him. He didn't walk away because he wanted something new. He walked away because what they had, as meaningful as it was, no longer made room for who he was becoming. Love, when it stops growing, starts hurting. He didn't want to keep pretending. Didn't want to keep shrinking himself to make things work. He wanted to be able to speak without being dismissed, to be held without feeling like he had to earn it, to be loved not for what he provided but for who he was when he stopped performing. And so he made a choice not against her but for himself. Not because the love was gone, but because staying meant losing the last fragile pieces of who he truly was. This kind of love doesn't explode. It fades. It waits. It mourns while still alive. And when it finally breaks, there's no noise. Just a quiet closing of a chapter that once felt like home. He didn't burn the bridge. He just stopped crossing it. Because every time he did, he left more of himself behind. Some men don't stop loving. They just stop staying. Because love without freedom becomes a cage. And so they leave not to forget but to survive. Somewhere tucked away in a drawer or the back of his mind is a photo he never threw out, a memory he never erased, a piece of her still sacred, still untouched. There are men who love in silence for the rest of their lives. They don't talk about it, but it's there in the songs they don't skip, in the dreams they never retell, in the way they glance at an old photo and pause. Let's hear their stories. Jack was 52 when he signed the divorce papers. 27 years of marriage, and the final signature felt less like an ending and more like an admission. He had become something functional in the relationship, reliable, predictable, necessary, but no longer seen. I was the one fixing the leaking pipes, taking care of the bills, making sure everything worked, he said. But somewhere along the way I stopped being her partner. I became the guy who just kept things running. He never wanted luxury. He wanted laughter, curiosity, presence. Instead, he became the background to her life, visible only when something broke. So he left. Not because he didn't love her anymore, but because he couldn't spend the rest of his life as a tool in the shed of her world. Miguel was 47. Still married, still sharing a bed, still seeing her every day. But the silence between them was louder than any argument they'd ever had. He would speak, and her eyes would drift to her phone. He'd ask about her day, but the question never returned. What used to be long conversations under blankets became quick exchanges about groceries and calendars. I felt lonelier with her than I did when I was alone, he admitted. And that kind of loneliness, the kind that lives inside a relationship, is the one that wears a man down the fastest. Miguel didn't leave in one day. He left in stages, emotionally first, then mentally. And when the time finally came to pack his things, he realized he'd already been gone for years. Then there was Thomas, 60 years old, calm, deliberate, quiet, even in heartbreak. He stood at the edge of the living room, suitcase by the door. His wife asked nothing. She just watched. And then he said it, not with anger, not with guilt, but with a clarity he had earned over decades. I still love you, but I need to love myself more than this relationship allows me to. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't cry. He just picked up the pieces of himself that had been scattered over the years and walked away, hoping that somewhere ahead there was still time to feel whole again. 3 men, different lives, same ache. They didn't leave because they stopped loving. They left because they could no longer live in places where they were no longer alive. And maybe that's what we've never been taught, that a man can still love deeply and still choose to go. But if that's true, if they still loved, what then could have made them stay? Let's go back for a moment to the beginning, to the warmth, to the laughter. What would have been enough to keep them from ever having to walk away? They would have stayed if they could still be themselves, not the edited version, not the filtered one shaped by expectations and compromises, but the man they were before they had to start shrinking their voice just to keep the peace. They would have stayed if someone had truly listened, not just to the words but to the silence between them, to the sighs at the end of long days, to the pauses in their sentences when they didn't feel safe enough to finish the truth. They weren't asking to be worshipped. They were asking to be witnessed. They would have stayed if the weight wasn't always on their shoulders, if love didn't feel like a job description, if emotional effort wasn't a one-way street, if they didn't have to choose every battle, suppress every need, and smile while quietly falling apart. They would have stayed if coming home felt like returning to a safe place, not stepping back into tension, if softness had remained in the small things, if they hadn't spent years performing strength while begging for softness inside. These men, so many of them, never needed perfection. They just needed presence, not grand gestures but quiet understanding, not constant agreement but mutual respect, not someone to fix them but someone who wouldn't let them disappear. Most men don't walk away when things get tough. They walk away when they feel like they're slowly becoming invisible, and by the time they leave, they've already mourned the relationship 1,000 times in silence. They leave not because they want less, but because they finally realize they deserve more. Not more love, but love that lets them exist fully. Because in the end, walking away isn't always rejection. Sometimes it's a final act of self-preservation. They're not running. They're protecting the parts of themselves that haven't been lost yet. Not every goodbye is a failure. Sometimes it's the most honest thing a person can do. Love, as deep and real as it is, doesn't always have the power to save 2 people at once. But sometimes it saves one, and that has to be enough. There comes a point when staying becomes more damaging than walking away, when love starts to hurt more than it heals, when silence replaces connection and survival replaces joy. Leaving in those moments is not about giving up on the other person. It's about finally choosing not to abandon yourself. If you've ever walked away from someone you still loved, not because you stopped caring, but because staying would have meant losing yourself, your story matters. Share it. Because somewhere out there, someone is carrying the same silence, the same guilt, the same ache, and your words might help them understand what their own heart has been trying to say. Walking away doesn't mean giving up. Sometimes it means choosing yourself, and that choice is not selfish, it's necessary.